This program is made possible by the Columbia Festival of the Arts and the Patuxent Publishing Company. Madison Smartt Bell talks with Mary Gordon.
Oh, yes.
Enjoy being severe.
But then I don't want to get bogged down in this interminable. Welcome to The Writing Life. My name is Madison Smartt Bell, and I have here Mary Gordon, who is the author of a great many works of fiction, including The Rest of Life, most recently, which is a collection of novellas, novels, including The Other Side, Men and Angels, The Company of Women, and Final Payments, a collection of stories called Temporary Shelter, and a collection of essays called Good Boys and Bad Girls. And Mary is also the recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship and the Lala Wallace Reader's Digest Award. And she is a tenured professor at Barnard College. I wanted to begin by reading a statement that you once made about your own work, and then maybe quarreling with it a little bit. My subject as a writer, says Mary Gordon, has far more to do with family happiness than with the music of the spheres. I don't know what the nature of the universe is, but I have a good ear. What it hears best are daily rhythms, for that is what I value, what I would wish as a writer to preserve. And the essay goes on a little later to identify that choice on the one hand as, again, I quote Ms. Gordon, a predilection for the minor, and then in another way to reject that from another point of view. And I have given that some thought. And it seems to me that while it is true that you have always chosen as your setting kind of small and indeed constricted domestic situations, the family romance, as it were, there's also always this involvement with the Catholic Church, because the people that you write about generally happen to be Catholics, and that it's that engagement with the larger issues that are sort of forced upon the subject by the Church that gives the work a larger scope.
I think that what I was trying to respond to out of a certain amount of irritation and anger is the definition of major and minor, which
Yes.
it seemed to me had largely been created by males for males. And so anything that happened outside or involving physical pain, violence, or unwilling sex was considered major. And anything else outside those rubrics was considered minor. And it seems to me that's been one of the most heinous umbrella, if you can have a heinous umbrella, that's kind of a
I'd like to see a heinous umbrella.
That's kind of an odd notion, but it's been a very constricting and crippling thing for women writers and for their readers. One of the most irritating and consistent things that gets said to me is I will have read, and a man will come up to me and say, "My wife reads your books." And
well,
I'm supposed to say, "Well, of course, what are you too busy killing wild animals and making nuclear war to read my books?"
Well, unfortunately, that's true. I mean, speaking as a major male novelist, I know very well that if you can't get women to read your work, you're dead. I mean, they're the only people who read in this country.
But what's
almost.
interesting is that a woman considers reading a male writer reading up, and a man considers reading a woman writer as an act of perhaps enormously broad-minded condescension. And so women think it's kind of sexy to read something that will even describe them in quite degraded or condescending terms, but a man entering what would be the inner life of a woman feels like he's doing her a favor, that it's something he doesn't need to know. Whereas women, I think they need to know about the lives of men. Men think they're doing women a favor to know about the lives of women, and that's sort of what I was responding to in trying to take the word minor and set it on its head.
Right. Well, the idea that I had about that and about that statement in your essay is that it makes me compare your work to the work of other artists of domesticity, many of whom do happen to be women, so that if I compare your work to a really brilliant miniaturist like Anita Bruckner, say, it really does seem to me that your writing has a larger scope and engages with larger issues, despite the fact that it tends to be, in terms of its plot, set rather tightly. It's inside the house, which I think is your phrase from the essay, instead of outside the house, for the most part.
And also, I think it's inside the mind
yes.
to a certain extent. And I think as I've got older and I've written more, that trying to get the balance between inside the mind or inside the soul and an engagement in the world is something I'm more interested in as a project, perhaps, than I would have been when I started out. And so, but I think your point is well taken, that willy-nilly, if you were brought up as a Catholic, particularly in the triumphalist days in the 50s, in which I was, you were in the world. And there was a sense of being part of a worldwide movement which was controlling salvation. And so the stakes were very high. And I think I've always written as if the stakes were very high. And so maybe that creates a movement out of domesticity, because everything's sort of at stake.
Definitely. Well, let me enunciate another crackpot theory about your work. It seems to me everyone in your audience is learning more about your personal life than they used to know because of this work that you're writing about your father and your parents and your childhood, which is nonfiction and autobiographical. And it occurred to me while reading and listening to selections from Losing My Father, that perhaps, and you may not feel that this is true, but that your first two novels are, in a sort of covert, cryptic way, autobiographical novels, and that Final Payments is almost exclusively about the relationship with a brilliant, charming, intellectual father who may or may not, to some extent, resemble your own, obviously not completely. That The Company of Women is about a childhood spent somewhat in the manner that your childhood was spent after the death of your father when you were 10, among aunts and a household of women, to reiterate the title. If that's so, what is the advantage for you of going back over this material in nonfiction?
I think one of the advantages is that I could not put my father into fiction and have anybody believe him. His life is so improbable that, people would think I had moved into magic realism. And since he didn't live in South America, that wouldn't wash. And there was a way in which I was taking a journey as myself, and I felt that I needed to comment upon that journey of discovery as myself in a way that I couldn't or wouldn't in fiction. And also the facts of the case were so extraordinary that I couldn't have made them up. And so I felt that in a way it was almost a spiritual exercise. That I was taking a journey, and that it was a journey among facts, and a journey with one foot in fact and one foot in invention, and that fluid and unstable relationship between memory and invention and fact in some way was my subject. And that had to be, it seemed to me, nonfiction, because there had to be a real I at the center. Or that's the way it was whispered to me. I can see
by your demons,
yeah,
I take it. Okay.
Yeah, I can imagine somebody else having done it another way, but it was whispered to me as nonfiction.
Would you like to read a little bit of it?
Sure. This is a chapter called Reading My Father, and my father was a writer, so one of the ways I get to know him is by reading his texts. Whenever and however I was living, whatever place my father took in that life, it was always important to me that he was a writer. Now it's important in a new way. His being a writer, a published writer, that is, someone whose words were public, means that others can know him as I do. What my father wrote is the property of the world. For the first years of my life, I thought he wrote for me. This is because among the earliest things I read were magazines he edited. In 1953 and 54, he had a magazine called The Children's Hour. It was the size of the Reader's Digest, but printed on newsprint rather than glossy paper. It contained condensations and adaptations of the classics, Aesop's fables, tales from Shakespeare, Bible stories, synopses of Gilbert and Sullivan. In addition, there were jokes and limericks and pages of things for children to do on a rainy day, directions for making a bank out of an empty salt container, instructions on how to make your own Halloween costume. The Children's Hour ran only 2 issues, but on both mastheads, I am listed as editor-in-chief, although in 1954, when it folded, I was not yet 5 years old. Even when I read them first in 1953 and 1954, I had the sense of something called the past that my being born had ruined. A fragile screen, highly ornamental, and I burst through it at my birth, creating as I went the modern age. The present ate up the past like an acid burning out the faces in a photograph, like spun sugar on my tongue. The past was consumed before I had time to appreciate it. In becoming the present, the past grew valueless. The past had also happened in a place far from where I was living. It was somewhere else, but its location was fluid. Anything graceful, formal, impractical was part of it. It was Italian, German, French, anything but American. Nothing spare or linear belonged to the pastness of the past. Now when I hold copies of The Children's Hour, I see that I collected the past right there. I looked at the pictures in it obsessively. I savored them, taking them in slowly, putting them away to tantalize myself, to strengthen myself, then looking at them again. They did what art is meant to do. They left me fully satisfied and enlarged. I had a sense of a world greater than anything I had known or seen or been a part of, and which I knew very well I had no chance of entering. But for the times that I spent looking at the pictures, looking was enough. It was everything. There was nothing desirable in life outside them. One of my father's other publications was a girly magazine published in the 1920s called Hot Dog. This is about my coming upon Hot Dog as a 12-year-old girl. I don't know how I first learned about Hot Dog, knew that my father had edited a magazine with jokes and sexy pictures, but it was some time after his death. I was still a child. It was part of the story I carried in place of my absent father. I understood that I had a father with a split life, a life that cleft in two like a sacred oak struck by lightning, from which cleft undying flowers bloom. After my father's death, people tell me the story of his life in the language of the lives of the saints. Already before I am 10 years old, I have a father who is legendary, who leaves behind him, trails behind him, not money or property, but myth, which seems like an animal product secreted from a living body, the silk from the worm. Or perhaps what's left isn't from an animal, perhaps it's manna, or perhaps it's both manna and silk, the product by which I was clothed and fed. So at a very young age, I knew my father had another life. In this other life, he had money and success, but he had lost his soul. Later, he was anointed, marked. His soul burst and shone, but he was poor, a failure. And one way he had lost his soul was publishing a magazine with pictures of sexy women, women I always know are nothing like me, with whom I will never have anything in common. I don't remember when I first heard about Hot Dog, but I remember exactly first coming upon it. I was 12, looking upon my father's books. Stuck in a book, a volume of the Catholic Encyclopedia, a study of the priesthood or the Eucharist, is a small magazine called Hot Dog. I knew it was my father's, so I opened it looking for a trace of him. But I found a bare-breasted woman plaintively looking out at the camera. Underneath her body is the caption, "Lover, come back." I was shocked and outraged. I ripped the magazine into many pieces and flushed it down the toilet, satisfied that at least I had destroyed the evidence.
Now for my most intrusive and unpleasant question. It seems to me, and again, this is a theory you may wish to dispute. I notice you're not disputing my theories. I hope it's not because you're being polite, because they certainly may be wrong. The more I hear of this book, the nonfiction book about your childhood, and bearing in mind Flannery O'Connor's remark, which you've also quoted in an essay, that everything important for a writer occurs before the age of 6, it really does seem to me that a great deal of your fiction, if not all of it, has been driven by the peculiarities of a family situation, that you have on the one hand this very conservative and conventional Irish Catholic world into which entered your father, a convert from Judaism with an extremely mysterious past, some of which you are still discovering. All writers, I think, have secrets that kind of give them power. Frequently these secrets are formed in childhood. I have secrets of that kind that drive my work. I would never tell them to anyone. And it seems to me that you're telling the secrets in a way, and that I would be afraid to do that. Does that worry you?
No, because these aren't probably the secrets.
I'm sorry?
Probably what I'm telling are not the real
They're
secrets.
not the real secrets. Okay, so it's a magician's trick.
Yes. I think, yeah, it is a trick. And of course, with autobiographical writing, in a way, one is always in bad faith, because you're still only telling what you want to tell. And who knows what's being hidden? Who knows what, in fact, might be the true, dark, unsayable, unbearable story. So I wasn't frightened. Also, I think the way that these secrets drive us are as metaphors. And I think there are two things that have driven my work that are rooted in biography, two metaphors, which is early loss. And my mother, who was handicapped, gave me the image of the brokenness of the body. And that's not a secret. I can talk about that. The exploration will come, it seems to me, in traveling through these dark, labyrinthian metaphors. And I think because they are rather large metaphors, loss and brokenness, I probably have quite a long way to travel in them.
So I now get the feeling that Losing My Father is really a novel in a way. It's a sort of Mailer-esque nonfiction novel.
Except that I really tried not to lie. There were some things that I would have liked not to reveal. But it seemed to me one of the subjects that I was writing about was revealing what is unbearable to reveal and then commenting on it. But nevertheless, behind or beneath what is revealable, there's always the unrevealable. And that's, I think every writer deals with that. That's the gap between language and what language can reveal, which is always the frustration and the mystery of the whole enterprise.
Let me talk a little bit about the other side of the picture as I see it, which is the Catholic Irish side. It's occurred to me more and more as this book about your father unfolds that in some ways you are an insider, as he was, in Irish Catholic culture, and in some ways an outsider, since you came in a way from somewhere else, coming partly from him. It seems to me that that kind of straddled position is what often gives a writer the perspective that's necessary to write about something as devouring as Irish Catholic culture. But with that in mind, I wanted to ask you two questions. One, are you Irish? And two, are you Catholic?
Partly both, I guess. Yes, I'm Catholic because it so formed me, and also there are parts of it that I think are irreplaceable. There are parts of Catholicism that I think the world would not be better off without. And there's nothing good. I mean, I can't see replacing them with Oprah Winfrey or the Michigan Militia, which are probably your two options. And there is a way in which the Catholic Church, that doesn't exist in the world, but only in its best imagination of itself, provides an example of charity and openness and, as I said, things being at stake, which is of great value to me. Now, the way most Catholics behave has nothing to do with that, but that's true of everything in human beings. I mean, all institutions stink, and all ways that human beings live out their ideals are usually failures. So I'm partly Irish because I'm only quarter Irish. I guess I'm partly Catholic because there's so much of Catholicism in the way that it's practiced that appalls me. And so I'm a real mutt. In everything that I do, I'm a mutt. I was born a mutt, and I guess I'll die one.
Again, bearing in mind Flannery O'Connor's remark about everything of importance happening before the age of 6, and I'm also reminded of something in one of your essays where you talk about being a sort of saintly little girl who would go out into the playground with the quote-unquote rough playmates and display a crucifix to try to quell their bad behavior, which you say had no effect. Did you have a happy childhood being a Catholic? I mean, was this a good way to grow up in your eyes, or
was it happy? No, I mean,
happy and good are not necessarily the same thing.
Right. It was rich. It was a rich childhood, and it was not a foolish childhood, and it was not a wasted childhood. And it was a deeply unhappy childhood, but it was a serious childhood. And it's certainly not the childhood I would want for my children. But it, again, I keep repeating this phrase, it taught me how much is at stake. And I'm not sure that a happier childhood would have taught me that. I think there was a little too much unhappiness, but there it was.
I think I'd better say, as my questions become more inquisitorial, that I am not myself a Catholic, so that's not the point. But in reading your nonfiction, it seems to me that your thinking has been in some way shaped by the scholastic tradition that begins with Aquinas and comes on up. Is that true? Were you influenced by those writers?
No, as a matter of fact, I think I'm anti-scholastic.
Okay.
That the tradition of scholasticism, it seems to me, is an odd combination of excessive abstraction and excessive materialism.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to think of myself as always being hybrid, as always being a mutt, as always being a synthesizer. And there's a kind of rigor that I am very drawn to, but I don't think it's a scholastic rigor. There is a dualism that I think comes from being Irish, and that comes from the very structure of Christianity that I both love and have to fight against. That there's a clarity of terms that I adore, but that very clarity of terms can exclude too much. And I think I'm always trying to make some sort of balance between the clarity of the terms and the cruel exclusion that clarity demands. It's tough.
There's an intellectual thoroughness in your nonfiction that I associate with the scholastic tradition, and what I think I have to discard this theory, but I'll declare it anyway.
Well, you wanted me to disagree.
So I went to the trouble of evolving it. Yes, no, I'm glad you did. It proves you're honest. But I thought it would be an interesting irony that for you, with one foot in the church and one foot out, as I've said, if the kind of intellectual tradition with which you quarrel in many ways also in some ways mechanically gave you power.
I think that it demanded a sort of clarity, but I think where I'm anti-theoretical in my nature,
yes.
I'm anti-systemic. there's something about somebody telling me that there's one way of describing the world that is the right way that immediately makes me rebel. And yet I am very drawn to ways of describing the world that seem to be the case and that seem to ask the most difficult questions and to take in the most difficult evidence.
Yes.
And to have a kind of shapeliness about them. But I don't think those are ever large theories. I like close readings. I guess maybe I'm an intellectual new critic. I like looking at things closely and trying to make sure as much as possible, though of course this is a doomed and impossible task, that what you say is the case. And I kind of feel ferocious about that.
Perfect. I have a number of questions more that I'd still like to ask, but we seem to be out of time, so let me thank you, Mary Gordon, for appearing on The Writing Life, and thank you all for watching the program. And I think this is probably going to be our last time through.
Right.
No, I'm sorry.